Welcome everyone to today's panel discussion, the OR of the future, how industry experts are making it a reality. I'm Brian Zimmerman with Becker's, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. Thank you so much for joining us. So before we get going, I'm going to first walk us through some housekeeping instructions and an overview of what to expect throughout the course of our discussion. So you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. If at any time you have trouble with the audio or video, first try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We've got folks on the back end who are available to help you out there. So technology advances, in addition to labor and supply chain shortages and increasing pressures to perform procedures outside of acute care settings, are fueling an OR evolution. Hospitals are recognizing the need to make OR smarter and more efficient in response to these challenges and opportunities. To unpack these trends with me today, I'm joined by a couple of excellent leaders. I'm going to tap on each of them to share a bit about their professional backgrounds and organizations before we get into the discussion. Javed, why don't you take the lead there?
Sure. My name is Javad Parvizi. I'm professor of orthopedic surgery at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. I am currently an active surgeon that performs around 500 joint replacements a year. I'm mostly hip and knee surgeon. And I operate both in the academic hospital setting, which is a university, as well as ASCs. And we also do outpatient joint replacements.
I appreciate that context there, Javed. Joel, why don't you go next?
Hi, my name is Joel Collier. I'm a global portfolio director for Cardinal Health. I manage a couple of sizable product categories that are focused in the OR. And one of the things that my team and I focus on is really looking at where healthcare is going and trying to create new solutions and innovations that are going to solve some of those unmet needs.
Excellent. Thank you for being here, Joel. Thank you for being here, Javed. Let's dive in here. So the first set of questions, the question I want to get to really has some of the lasting, it wants to unpack some of the lasting impacts of COVID-19 on surgical practices. So to begin here, what are the challenges and opportunities related to surgical care in the aftermath of COVID-19? How can healthcare leaders, policymakers, and stakeholders really collaborate to shape a more resilient and sustainable healthcare ecosystem after this collective trauma the industry has all had to navigate over the last few years? Joel, do you want to talk about what you're seeing from your vantage point in terms of your partnerships and other things like that, what folks are going through?
Sure, this is something we've had our finger on the pulse on for a while. The challenges are numerous and broad-reaching, and they continue to morph over time. Dynamics such as staffing shortages and ongoing supply chain issues continue to be the top of mind for the industry. But other changes like the rapid acceleration of telemedicine as a commonly accepted practice has really improved access and increased efficiency by improving the pre-admission process. I mean, just to make one example, I believe the pandemic has taught all of us what we need to be more nimble and more communicative with one another to ensure the industry continues to react to an ever-changing landscape, and knowing that those changes are probably going to be coming at an increasingly rapid rate.
Yeah. Disruption is kind of the standard at this point in time, right, Joel?
Yes, it is.
Javed, would you add anything to that? Any additional perspective you'd like to share here?
Oh, no, great points. Obviously, on the physician side, the staff shortage is really creating a major challenge in not having nurses, for example, available to see the patients. And that has been a catalyst to drive, as well as COVID-19, obviously, to drive the digital health or telehealth. So instead of bringing patients back to the office to see their wound, we are now relying mostly on pictures taken of their wounds. We are relying on wound coverages that doesn't require removal, for example, shifting away from the use of material or stuff that would require patients' visit to the office. And on top of that, monitoring the patients in the post-operative period is now shifting towards telehealth as well. Telehealth to, one, monitor them, two, to sort of raise the red flags with them. So absolutely, as Joel articulated, that's exactly the same issues that we're feeling.
Thank you, Javed. I appreciate you sharing your experience there. And let's talk about some of these shifts here, some of the procedural volume shifts that are happening. So Obviously, there's a lot of various trends really driving shifts in care from acute settings to non-acute settings. What are those factors that are driving procedural volume from the OR, hospital OR to the ASC, and what are the potential benefits and challenges associated with this trends for various stakeholders? Joel, I know you've got a really good handle on this trend and how things are shaking out here. Can you share your thoughts with our attendees?
Sure. I mean, the reasons driving this shift are numerous. Factors such as lower cost, improved convenience for patients and surgeons alike, as well as improvements in technology are making non-acute setting more attractive to several people. We're also seeing specific types of procedures like subsets of orthopedic surgeries moving more rapidly out of the acute setting as many types of surgeries are becoming more commonplace in this setting and resulting in fewer post-surgical complications. Some factors such as staff shortages that were mentioned earlier need to be factored in this shift to ensure the facilities are properly prepared to receive this increased volume. But as with anything else, as healthcare providers gain more expertise in specific areas, they'll become more proficient and efficient, and we'll continue to see this trend increase.
Thank you, Joel, for that overview. Javed, does that sort of align with what you're seeing as well?
Absolutely, and I think as Joel mentions, in orthopedics particularly, we're seeing a shift from hospital settings into ASCs and outpatient surgery. And I think really the three things that Joel mentioned drives this. One is improvements in surgical delivery of care that's allowed us to do the operations with less invasiveness and with better care, better anesthesia, better surgical techniques that has made the operation easier for patients to recover from. Number two is the economics. Obviously, the real cost of care is mostly to do with outpatient rehabilitations, for example, nursing care, et cetera. So that has certainly done that. And then declining reimbursement for the surgeons has also had perhaps acted as some degree of a catalyst to try drive into the ASCs. And then the third is the outcome. I mean, patients want to be home. You know, our patients are so well informed in this day and age that they have better social support systems. They are much more inclined to want to recover faster. So all of these have been the real impetus as to why we're seeing a shift from hospital settings to ASCs.
So very much sort of a patient preference trends here, right? Some consumer trends for it would be a term we throw out. This is really being driven by what patients want, correct?
Correct.
Excellent. So then the question I want to ask is really, how can, and it's come up quite a bit already, Javed, in terms of you've certainly referenced the use of technology and telehealth being a supporter here, but let's dive in a little bit deeper on that too. Can we get some thoughts, some takes on how technology and innovation can really be leveraged to support this shift from the hospital operating room to an ASC? Javed, can you share more about that? You know, thinking here about advancements also in minimally invasive techniques, telemedicine's come up, but also perioperative care pathways. Anything you can add on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Matt, the perioperative care pathways in particular have been very, very important. Look, when you operate on a patient, what worries the surgeon and the medical team is whether this patient will or will not run into any complications, and try to optimize the patient prior to surgery, and then also monitoring them closely in the postoperative period to ensure that their journey through the surgical procedure was a smooth one and they didn't run into a problem. So how do you do this? So the preoperative or perioperative care pathways have been incredibly important. The employment of artificial intelligence currently to try to predict, for example, which patient will run into a problem with venous thromboembolism or with need for intensive care unit monitoring, etc. All of those are in full effect in many institutions that have high volume, and they've proven to be extremely useful. And then part of that is also the ASC. Since we're discussing the ASCs, you know, not every patient is a candidate to have the operation done and go home the same day. So we do need to have some form of metrics that will help us determine which patients are or not candidates for ASC and outpatient procedures, and what else we need to implement to try to ensure that we minimize their chances of infection, for example, complications related to the operation. And there have been numerous apps and websites with new technologies that have sprung up in the last few years that has allowed us to effectively, one, develop these perioperative protocols, two, implement them, and three, to monitor their effect on patient outcomes. So we've seen real exciting technologies that have already come through, and many more that will be coming through in the years to come.
Thank you, Javed. And you entered in some new technological components here, thinking about predictive AI, metrics, and really making sure things are sort of, the importance of clinical and data-driven decision making right here in every capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most critical.
And Joel, what would you say, are the key technologies in order to sort of make this transition, these volume changes, really effective and a win for everyone involved?
Yeah, we've actually done some research, and it's pointed to several technologies that are emerging and gaining traction at an increasing rate. I divide these areas into two major categories. I like to classify as little I and big I, with the I standing for innovation. I classify little I as ensuring there's enough access to power, for needed equipment in the OR, and then integrating improved lighting applications as advances are made in technology. Think about your cars. We've just changed the lighting on cars, how that advances over time. And then big I really encompasses emerging advances in things like robotics, 3D printing, and of course, artificial intelligence, affectionately called AI, which all have their own specific, I'll say, opportunities and challenges as they become more integrated in the overall healthcare landscape. I know AI is currently creating the most buzz and is making many people think about the implications of this evolving technology, not just in healthcare, but across our broader lives, right? So I think that's going to be really interesting to monitor. But again, as we look at those things, I'll take robotics as an example. How's AI going to change the landscaping of what, robotics looks like today? So again, back to that, I'll say increasing rate of change and adoption. I think it's something we all need to be aware of and make sure that we're being very open and transparent with one another as we try to ultimately do our best to improve patient care.
Yeah, I want to dig into on the AI components here. But before we do that, Joel, are there any other technologies you'd like to add to this list in terms of what's really going to, impact the future and influence the future of the operating room?
Well, one I'd mention, and Dr. Provisi can add his thoughts as to, is robotics, right? So, several years ago, robotics were, I'll say, just sort of a niche area. Now we have medical students coming out and practicing where they've been really intensely trained on the robotic machines to do their surgery. So that changes your investment in capital, your recruiting techniques that you're going to have for different students, those sorts of things. So again, just being aware of where, the old saying, where the puck is going instead of where it is today, and understanding that so you can adjust both your practice, your recruiting, your hiring, all those things you need to do to make sure that you're set up for the most success possible.
Thank you, Joel. Javed, anything to add quickly on that, maybe the robotics front?
Yeah, on top of what Joel just mentioned, I think also augmented reality, AR, VR has also changed the landscape, both in terms of education, training, and potentially we'll see very different future for the medical students and the residents in how they train and how they run the ORs in the future as well.
Excellent. And so you both have mentioned AI and brought up AI to this point in a couple different iterations or forms. But I want to get your feedback and questions specifically around how the integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the operating room can really enhance surgical outcomes and improve patient safety as well. I would love to hear some thoughts on that. Javed, do you want to take the lead?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm the least expert in the field of AI because, as you know, it's just such an evolving field, very complex, extremely promising, at the same time, extremely challenging. AI has brought some great innovations in ability for us to do better in terms of taking care of our patients. But at the same time, it is complicated, and it's not as simple as just implementing it and then taking the results or its recommendations blindly and then implementing into practice. So the areas where we have employed AI is, for example, the actual delivery of care in the operating room, how long the patient is on the operating table, what you can do to try to minimize their chance of venous pooling and prevent or minimize the chance of venous thromboembolism. We've also implemented AI into the perioperative protocols that predicts which patients are at higher risk of infection and potentially implement additional strategies to minimize the risk of infection. We now have AI that predicts which patients may run into a problem with their orthopedic procedures in the form of fractures intraoperatively because of the pre-existent osteopenia or osteoporosis. So the list goes on, man. What I will tell you is that it certainly is very, very promising, and it is definitely going to be here. We just need to make sure, to your earlier point, we collect the appropriate data, and you feed the appropriate data for AI to be able to have its most positive impact. In the absence of good data, obviously AI is also going to malfunction or provide information that might not be as useful.
Yeah, data is certainly key here, but I'm curious too, Javed, if you could talk a little bit more. As you pointed out, this is new, right? This is new stuff, and folks all over are really trying to wrap their arms around it and figure out where it's going to be useful. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the decision-making process behind how you decide when and where to implement AI solutions and maybe when not to? Can you talk about, give us an inside look at what that all entails for you?
Yeah, AI is employed in procedures right now, procedures that are being performed at very, very high volume. And then we decide on, because obviously data collection is easier in that group of patients. If you're doing an operation 5 times a year and you're trying to implement AI, that's going to be very difficult than if you have something that we're doing 1.3 million of. So high volume operations, and then also operations that are potentially can lend themselves to improvements, both in terms of improving outcome and preventing complications, as well as areas for potential cost reduction. Because all of us are under obviously huge pressure, financial pressure, trying to perform these operations by minimizing the complications and also improving outcome while reducing costs. So AI has had a fantastic role in terms of cost reduction in the OR, predicting which patients you need to open 2 trays versus 3 trays for, which patients need to have additional material available. And it has actually performed extremely well in terms of, for example, deciding which group of patients would benefit from specific administration of specific pharmaceutical agents, such as extended antibiotics, intravenous antibiotics, dual antibiotics, etc. So I know it's really broad terms, but in my field, it has certainly played a great role in smoothing out the journey of the patients through the OR while trying to improve the outcome.
John, I appreciate you walking us through that there. Joel, what would you add here on the AI machine learning front before we move on a little bit?
Well, just like Dr. Parvizi said, he's not an expert in AI. I'm not an expert in performing surgical procedures, but one area that I get excited about is how do you collect data on a more broad basis, right? So how can Dr. Parvizi see data from similar types of procedures that are being performed on the West Coast or down south or something like that? So you can build, I'll say, more complete data, but then can also share that more broadly. So I think that's one that makes me really excited. And then there's some other things as well. I think we have to be cautious about it in terms of how does it change the landscape around data sharing, HIPAA constraints, those sorts of things. So we need to, I'll say, move aggressively, but also thoughtfully as we look at what this technology can bring. And then some of the watch outs are things we need to be aware of going in with our eyes wide open.
Yeah, I appreciate the note about the balance between aggressiveness and thoughtfulness, right? You can't be sort of laggards in this space, but you also can't be cavalier either, right, Joel?
Right. Well, we have a saying on my team: if no decision is making a decision, right? So, yeah, if you decide to sit on the sidelines, I think you're going to very quickly find yourself looking ahead at others that are making decisions. So, I think it's something that you need to decide how you're going to get integrated into it, and then move forward aggressively.
Yeah, absolutely. And then let's move here and talk a little bit more about sustainability in the operating room. So I'm hearing more and more about sort of reusable products, recycling, greenhouse gas emission, and sort of carbon footprint reductions as being areas that folks are focusing on in order to help achieve sustainability within the operating room, and as the operating room becoming a lever for sustainability. So I'm curious if either of you can share some examples of sustainable technologies that are currently being used in the operating room, and what kind of benefits or challenges are associated with the implementation of those technologies. Javed, do you want to go first here?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. We're seeing a shift. We're seeing a shift towards environmental awareness, because the carbon footprint of surgical procedures is not small. You should see the number of bags that get carried out of a surgical procedures after it's complete, even in small operations like carpal tunnel release or trigger finger operation, etc. So we're seeing a shift towards use of reusable surgical instruments, reusable surgical devices, smart monitoring systems, as well as energy efficient lighting in the operating room, minimization of number of trays that we have to use in surgical procedures. And each tray has to obviously go through cleaning process, a sterilization process with huge carbon footprint. These are not small things. And then we're also seeing a shift towards the use of more biodegradable materials during the surgical procedures, as opposed to the plastics and the other types of environmentally harmful materials. So the fact that we have all become more conscious of the environmental impact of the surgical procedures we perform is a step in the right direction.
Appreciate that, Javed. Joel, what would you add here? We've heard a lot about sort of energy efficient lighting, smart monitoring systems, and of course reusable equipment, reusable instruments. What would you add or expand upon here?
Well, what we've found, as we've discussed with customers, is sustainability right now means different things to different people. I mean, during the height of the pandemic, sustainability to many just meant I need the supplies that I need to do the surgeries that I need to do to get me through the day and through the week, to continue to care for patients. And so much contains today, but we're seeing that change over time. I mean, the move toward greater sustainability is more aspirational, I'd say right now. It needs to become less of a strategy, more of a tactic, and becomes more, and how do we actually start to execute? For example, we talk about, things like reducing landfill waste by a certain percentage. That exact path is, still to be determined based upon technology, based upon cost. And that's one thing I want to really focus on, is balancing the ability to do something versus the affordability to do it. Sustainability can refer to product changes like Dr. Parvizi is going through. It can also mean things like decreased packaging, more sustainable manufacturing processes. So I think that's one thing from an educational perspective. Someone like a Cardinal Health can actually lead our customers toward how do you identify and capture all these things, and then actually start to measure them and make sure you're making a meaningful impact. Right now, more sustainable solutions exist in a lot of areas, but truthfully right now, customers can't afford the cost trade-off. If you're going to pay 2 to 3 times more for something, it's just not really affordable at this point in time with everything that's going on in the industry. But like anything else, as those things are around and they become more efficient, people get more used to them, then that'll drive costs down. But as more and more people turn their attention to this effort, we'll see an acceleration of viable solutions becoming more available, and it'll just continue to accelerate like a lot of other things. I think the biggest thing we're seeing right now that's a gap is sort of what's being made at the C-suite or leadership levels of the hospital, and that's what's happening at clinicians, right? Because they're just trying to get through the day. And how do we marry those up? and make sure that those goals are aligned and that they're also realistic as we think about things like staff shortages, et cetera, just to make sure that the holistic solution makes sense for the broader organization as a whole.
Yeah, and Joel, let's talk a little bit more about that in terms of, really you have to have buy-in here among staff to really achieve sustainability. So can you talk a little bit, Joel, about how education, training, sort of spreading awareness through various initiatives can really help promote the adoption and utilization of more sustainable technologies in the operating room? Can you talk just a little bit about that and maybe dig into some of the barriers here also?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could look at this, but I think, for example, Dr. Parvizi mentioned reusable products. Now, reusable products, sound like, that's probably more sustainable, but then you have to look at the overall, okay, well, to reuse a product, I have to gather it, I have to reprocess it, I have to re-sterilize it, clean it, whatever it is, and get it back into the work stream. So how do you look at inputs like water usage, those sorts of things, transportation to move those things around to get them reprocessed, factor into that? So I think we need to be very honest with each other and very transparent in terms of what is the overall impact, and not looking at it as a very specific part of that puzzle in terms of, well, you're not putting it in the trash, but at the end of the day, putting something in the trash actually could be more economic or environmentally viable than something where you're actually having to reprocess it. So again, that's one thing we need to do about being transparent and open, and then making sure that we're using common systems to both evaluate technologies and then understand what kind of impact it's making. Because if you change like a simple process at a manufacturing plant, how does that actually ladder down to how that delivers into a final product? Those are things that we need to be more, I'll say, sophisticated about, and then come up with some common standards that we can actually hold ourselves accountable, but then also go to a customer and say, here's how we're measuring ourselves and holding us to standard, and then leveling the playing field across, not just in terms of for our own selfish benefit, but also to enable people to make the best overall decision. Again, back to what we said before, based on the data, and making sure we have a common place that from which we're doing the analysis.
Thank you, Joel. And Java, can you weigh in here in terms of what you see to barriers in terms of maybe adoption of these technologies? Prices come up, obviously. Just knowledge, general awareness. A lot of what Joel said was sort of understanding the context of different sort of processes and things like that. It might seem counterintuitive to think single use could be more beneficial, but you really have to dig into the various factors at play here. Can you just share a little bit of thoughts that you had while Joel was talking, or from your experience previously?
No, absolutely. I agree with you, and I agree with Joel completely. I mean, price pressure obviously is what really drives the adoption of new technologies. And then obviously evidence behind these changes. So that's why we need to monitor. And as Joel said, we need to be honest with the data to see if implementation of a protocol or procedure did achieve its intended objectives or it didn't. And that's why we've really been moving more and more towards evidence-based practices. And in a majority of hospital systems or practices now require evidence behind each of these new technologies, which are not easy to generate either. But yeah, price pressure clearly is one of those. And to your point, knowledge of a product, how do you market a product and do honest marketing, bring it to the attention of the medical community without letting the marketing be the main impetus for adoption. So that's why I think companies like Cardinal are committed to generating data and evidence behind everything and anything that they implement. And technologies of the future are definitely going to have a higher bar in terms of entry into a hospital system. Without evidence and data, I think they're going to struggle.
And data too, I imagine, is going to be essential to something else that I want to dig in a little bit deeper on as we near the close of our conversation, which is collaboration, right? Collaboration is going to be essential to really evolving and shaping the future of the OR. And by collaboration, I mean, between surgeons, engineer, data scientists, other stakeholders who are really, have a lot to do with how the OR is going to evolve in the coming years. So Can we get some thoughts, Joel? Maybe we can start with you here in terms of how you think about collaboration as a real influencer in terms of what the future of the OR is going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, communication just has to improve overall. It needs to happen more in real time. You know, the days of, hey, I'm going to wait for next month's value analysis committee meeting or something like that. You know, things are just happening so rapidly. We introduced a new product last year where we were estimating based upon, I'll say, traditional evaluation methods, it would take 4 to 6 weeks for customers to evaluate it and then decide to bring it in. We're seeing people making that decision in 24 to 48 hours because they needed product and they needed to service their patients. So again, just acting with a sense of urgency. And then to do that, obviously, you need to talk in front and understand that your goals and strategies are aligned and are viable, right? To make sure that you what you want to achieve is something that you actually have a path toward doing. We've even heard some customers mention the role of a chief change officer, and that's becoming more common to help navigate some of the accelerating need of change. So again, it's gonna be different tomorrow than it was yesterday, and then again next month. But again, I think the transparency and the openness and the willingness to act and move with speed are things that are going to be very key.
And Javed, what are your thoughts on collaboration specifically?
100% agree with Joe, what Joel just said. We have to remember that the objective here for all of us, whether it's the industry, the hospital, clinicians, pharmaceutical companies, etc., is one and one thing only: improve patient care. So with that common goal in mind, we need to develop a process that allows all of us to come together and do what is best for the patient. And I agree with Joel. I think communication, that's where it starts. And we've done a fairly good job in the past, but now with the ability to utilize newer industry and newer technologies, I think real-time communication will definitely help shape the future.
And so, as we've sort of discussed here throughout this conversation, there are many considerations sort of really affecting, influencing the future of the operating room. I want to zero in here on collaboration. So, Joel, can you talk first about sort of how collaboration between surgeons, engineers, data scientists, and other stakeholders really contribute and help drive the advancement, the evolution of the operating room? What is it? How is collaboration here going to bring the OR of the future to fruition?
Wow, there's so many that we could reference, right? Because again, who could have imagined 5 years ago talking about a pandemic, the severity of which we just came out of? So, I mean, I'll just pick one example. Earlier, I'd mentioned the growth of robotics, which means more surgeons being trained to use them during procedures. But there are other things downstream that happen from that. So because of the growth in that area, we're seeing double-digit annual growth rates in the consumables to support those, right? So are companies geared up to be able to do that? Or do they have I'll say, the bandwidth and the ability to support that? So those are some of the things we need to be thinking about. And I think coming from an old model, we kind of assume that history will repeat itself. And where I think we've had sort of blinders on from an industry perspective, we tend to look back and then try to predict forward. Right now, we need to take that into consideration, what's happened in the past, but also now put the lens on as things like AR coming into mind. How do we plan more proactively for that, and then be much more of a pioneering approach and try to think, okay, I really need to think differently about this. I need to think about how I'm going to more effectively utilize the space in my facility, how I'm going to embrace advances like the hybrid OR dynamic that's growing out there. How do I plan to use AI? Just because I plan to use AI for, I'll say, improved predictive analytics doesn't mean that everybody else is going to do that. So again, I think, I'll come back to what I said before. Open lines of communication, being very thoughtful and strategic in terms of where we're going, and then holding ourselves accountable that we're meeting those objectives that we set. And if we need to course correct, which we almost always do, then just being open and honest with ourselves and being nimble enough to make those changes. I say, when you forecast something, you're either lucky or wrong. So we're typically wrong, right? So as you learn those things and you make it more of okay, again, back to what Dr. Pivisi said, I'm doing the best for patient care and patient outcomes, then it takes some of the pressure off in terms of feeling like you have to always be right and saying, okay, ultimately I want better outcomes for both our facility as well as the industry as a whole.
If you're focusing on the patient, then that's going to be sort of your North Star to navigate whatever sort of comes to pass here, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
I know, and with my team and our organization, we always think about the patient first, and then obviously an extension of the patient is the clinicians that serve them. So that always tends to be at the forefront of our mind as we're looking at new solutions, technologies, changes in practice, et cetera, because we can build the best mousetrap out there, but if it's going to be accepted by our customers and then also patients ultimately, then it's wasted effort.
Right. Javed, what would you say here in terms of what are you anticipating? What challenges, opportunities are you thinking about that will come to pass in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, honestly, not much to add to what Joel said. Obviously, the price pressure is going to drive the industry towards being cost conscious. The environmental issues are at the forefront. And then I think there are opportunities to try to minimize the complications that we've seen in the past by employing AI again and improving patient outcomes. Shifting away from the inpatient setting to an ASC is going to have, again, its benefits, particularly in terms of improving patient outcomes and reducing cost. So employment of all the telehealth and digital health is also going to streamline the process for the patients and make them make healthcare providers more accessible to them. So these are all some of the changes that we've talked about, but I think Joel nicely articulated all of them.
Absolutely. Well, Javed, Joel, it was a pleasure to walk through this conversation with you. I've learned a lot from conversations like this, so deeply appreciate you taking the time. Let's jump now and take one or two audience questions here. Final reminder, if you've got a question for our panelists here, go ahead and enter that into the Q&A chat there you see on your screen. So let's jump to this question. Joel, I think this would be a good one for you. I believe it's directly addressed to you. So the attendee asked, what is something that you and Cardinal Health are working on that will impact the future of the OR?
Yeah, there are many things, but one, again, I feel is most important is focusing on customer engagement to both understand the challenges that exist as well as potential solutions that are either needed or already in development that we can help turn into I'll say commercially viable product that doesn't already exist. Dr. Parvizi and I have met because of some of these synergies that we're seeking, right? In terms of, instead of us just saying, okay, here's what we have, sort of like being a retail store, you come in and pick out what you want, is basically how do we be more collaborative in that arena. I mean, one timely example for us is we just launched a new hair management drape called Stray Away that we partnered with MedStar Health's innovation group, where a couple of their surgeons had an idea for more effectively managing hair during craniofacial and neurological procedures. And again, that's something we didn't have any line of sight to, but again, having the conversation with customers and understanding that was a problem, there wasn't a viable solution out there, and how much time they were wasting creating their own solution or trying to do things post-operatively, like picking individual strands of hair out of incisions, really got us excited about this project. So again, as we collaborate and communicate more with our customers and finding out what their challenges are, again, we're trying to bring solutions to bear that are really going to make them more efficient and again, have improved patient outcomes.
Appreciate that, Joel, and thank you to the attendee for a question. We'll close out here by I'm going to combine a couple of audience questions for you, Javed, which goes back to sort of what we discussed early on in this conversation. So the attendee asked, what types of surgical procedures are you seeing transition to the ASC setting the most? And then I'll pair that with another audience question, which is, what considerations should be taken into account when determining appropriate setting for a procedure? Javed, can you tackle those?
Yeah, sure. Just about any surgical procedure is really shifting to an ASC. It would have been definitely very unusual to think that knee replacement, for example, could be an outpatient procedure, but of course it is now. So is total hip. So in orthopedics, just about anything and everything. And with the move towards minimally invasive, even some of those complex spine procedures are now being shifted towards an ASC setting. Obviously, I know more about orthopedics than other fields, but clearly things like laparotomies and hysterectomies, nephrectomies, all these procedures that were done as part of as part of an inpatient procedure have now shifted towards ASC. So just about anything. As for really determining what is or is not appropriate for an ASC setting, I think there's been a huge amount of studies done to see what the issues are when you go from an inpatient into an outpatient or an ASC setting. And majority of the time, things like hypotension in the postoperative period, pain control. So these have led to innovations. Now we are allowing our patients to drink clear fluids all the way out as far as within 1 hour of the surgical procedure. We have now implemented very effective pain management procedures and protocols that allows our patients to leave within a few hours of their surgical procedure. And then again, we talked about the monitoring. Very close monitoring is in place, so patients have access to us and they don't have to travel to an ER or an urgent care with an issue that comes up right after discharge from the hospital. So these have really, in my opinion, revolutionized the way we deliver surgical care to our patients. And I'm sure we're going to see more and more of these become more effective in the future and make even more of the procedures that are being done on an inpatient basis become outpatient.
Thank you, Javed, for reviewing some of that and also going a little bit deeper on those types of procedures. I appreciate that. And that will bring us to the close of our time together. Joel, Javed, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure speaking with both of you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
I also want to thank Cardinal Health, of course, for sponsoring today's webinar. To learn more about the conversation we just had, please check out the resources section on your webinar console and do fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.